Next up, who was abducted by aliens? No, I'm in the wrong panel. Let's let's try this again. Hi everyone, and welcome to the panel about climate fiction and fascism, or rather, how to use climate fiction to fight fascism. And welcome. Thank you very much for coming. We're going to jump right into it, first with the bios, and then we'll start. I will read a couple definitions, which I think we are in agreement with, and then jump right into our questions. Michael, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, I'm Michael J. DeLuca. I'm the publisher of Reckoning, which is a journal of creative writing on environmental justice. We're in our 7th year, just reading for our 7th issue now. I'm also a writer. I have published a fair amount of short fiction and a novella called Night Roll, which was a finalist for the Crawford Award in 2020 and is anti-fascist, I hope.
Well, certainly not pro-fascist, so it's a good start. Next is Phoebe, and welcome, Michael.
Hi, y'all. I'm Phoebe Wagner. My pronouns are she, her. I'm coming to you from Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is the homeland of the Susquehannock and Lenni Lenape people. And I am a writer, editor, and academic. I kind of mixing all three of those together. For my editorial work, I'm primarily known for Sunvault, Stories of Solar Punk and Eco-Speculation, which I co-edited with Bronte Whelan. And I also have a debut novella coming out next year and a novel. So I also write a lot of fiction. And I teach creative writing at Lycoming College here in Williamsport, Pennsylvania.
Awesome. And congratulations to the baby. Abriana Tuller hopefully will be with us soon. We'll read her bio when she gets here. Next is Shane Burley.
Hey, everybody. Hey, so my pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I'm here in Portland. So I'm the author of Fascism Today, What It Is and How to End It, and Why We Fight. Essays on fascism, resistance, and surviving the apocalypse, both for AK Press. And I'm the editor of the upcoming anthology, comes out just a couple weeks. No Passaran, Anti-Fascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis. And I write for a bunch of places, NBC News, Daily Beast, Al Jazeera, Full Stop, Baffler, Independent, Jazzmin, and a bunch of others.
Very cool. You are a busy guy.
Yeah.
My pen name is Rob Cameron. It says so there on the little box. And my pronouns are is, was, and will be. No, I'm just kidding. It's going to be he and him. And I am the lead organizer for Brooklyn Speculative Fiction Writers and executive producer of CliFiCast NYC. I've been published in a bunch of places. And coming out soon in November is an essay in Solar Punk magazine on solar punk noir. And that is me. So let us jump right into our conversation. And we're going to start with a definition which I think everyone would agree with. I'm just going to read what we have. I started with the Webster's Dictionary rather than the Oxford Dictionary because we're in America, damn it. So we're going to start with that one. And then also what Michael added for fascism. It is a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual and stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictator leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forced suppression of opposition. I like Michael's because it has a bit more flavor to it. The idea that if you bind a bunch of skinny little spears around the executor's axe, it's harder for that axe to be broken. Organize enough people into mindless lockstep by whatever means necessary, primarily by stoking fear of the other, and you can force a status quo no matter how destructive. And now in everybody's life, I think we've all seen ample opportunities of that for that to be used. And then specifically eco-fascism. This is Michael's as well. It's fascism justified by dire ecological predictions, a way to approach ecological concerns while taking for granted the primary mover of ecological collapse, which is to say the concentration of power, resources, and wealth, like we talked about before mentioned dictators and leaders. And Phoebe also added, eco-fascism is consistently raising its ugly head in environmental thinking. The concept of lower population, this idea that part of climate change is a population crisis, also talked about in deep ecology, rather than big oil. And it is easy to co-opt. I'm going to come back to this point about co-opting, but she also added it's easy to co-opt other ideas into this conversation, like reproductive justice, but it's all just eco-fascism in the end. Shane, you didn't get a chance to jump on the definition before. Is there anything you want to add to what's been said?
Now, I think those things sum it up really well. In my first book, I talk about fascism having two sort of tentpoles that underlie it. One is the inherent belief that people are unequal, that they're unequal between groups of people, between individuals, and also that our identity chooses us. We don't choose our identity. So identity is something that's supposed to drive people. So as in the other definitions, the concept of the nation, also the concept of who's not in the nation, who's not in the group, and that inequality between those identities. And you'll see like across different fascist movements, they kind of hold those in constant. And when we're talking about eco-fascism, it's going to change really dramatically because we're in new conditions, new kinds of countries, new kinds of politics. And so I think it's useful to try and find what do these have in common with the past, because they'll look a little different.
Yeah, that's actually a really good segue into the very first question, which is what is eco-fascism's relationship to the climate crisis? Phoebe, I thought I'd start with you, then go Shane, and then Michael.
Yeah, so I think an important thing to just start off right away is remembering that in the US, there is a history of white supremacy and environmentalism, and environmentalism is coming from, there's this very strong connection with white supremacy, even down to very much the basics, like our national park system. It's pretty well understood at this point where, you know, removing indigenous people from the land and it was protecting it for white use and white enjoyment. So one of the ways that I see the climate crisis and eco-fascism being related is just even thinking about some of the ways that we employ environmental thinking, we employ ideas of sustainability is rooted in whiteness. And then that very easily leads into eco-fascism. So I think that is where I will leave it for other folks to add, but that is part of the conversation that I've been thinking about a lot.
Okay, and Shane.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really important about fascism is that it acknowledges crisis, but diverts the responsibility, and therefore actually protects those in power. It protects people from those who actually have control over the system. So like was just mentioned, the environmental movement is not a foundationally left-wing movement. It didn't emerge from the left. It didn't emerge from, like, for example, from colonized peoples. It didn't emerge from movements to fight for further equality. It emerged as a colonial project. And it was for a long time in the early days of conservation, tied to eugenics. It was tied to a right-wing vision of inequality and manifest destiny. So that's actually where it comes from. It's not that there's that type of environmental movement. That's actually its origin point. And for decades, it was foundationally anti-immigrant. It was really built around building strong borders. And so I think it's important to kind of live in the real world about what the environmental movement is. And that when we come with an environmental vision, it has to have a fundamentally different starting point. We can all agree that we're in climate collapse. That's just, those are the facts on the ground. But how we're going to deal with that has to come from a new starting point. And that's why there's a new focus on indigeneity. That's why there's a focus on integrating other kinds of movements. Because if you just take the environmental movement on its own, it has this right-wing baggage and this nationalist baggage that's sort of hard to pull out of it.
Michael.
Yeah, I'm no political historian, but it strikes me that to a similar extent to which environmentalism has come out of white supremacy, the concept of fascism isn't that old and postdates the Industrial Revolution. So the principles of colonization are very wrapped up in what we can call eco-fascism now, and it didn't make sense to call it then because the people who should have been able to voice that reaction were not offered a voice in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it brings to mind a story that I brought up previously, which is from H.G. Wells from many, many, many years ago, called something about gods. I forget. I had it in front of me. I will go back up to see if I can find the name of it. It was like a gods like us, something like that. But it was basically saying that it was basically about how control over the environment and control over who and what can procreate was the ultimate goal. And that is ultimately kind of like a white supremacist thing. And it has been from the very beginning. Do you think this idea has been co-opted for the good, or is it still a sheep in wolf's clothing? I mean, how much of the movement today is moving in the right direction versus, yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah,
it's so hard. Go ahead, Phoebe.
so Phoebe, then Michael, and then Shane didn't say anything, but I'll come back to Shane for the third.
Yeah, I just want to touch on, because you brought up about lower population. This, of course, ties into what Shane was saying about how environmentalism was anti-immigrant. And so it's always shocking to me, though it shouldn't be, when I'm in a space that is, supposedly leftist leaning, and someone will bring that up, right? Like, oh, well, it's a population issue. And that's been so thoroughly debunked at this point that it's not even, someone isn't up on their, on their reading. It's that this is racism and eco-fascism that's coming into play here. Because of course, it's never white populations that need to have any sort of lower population. It's the global South. And that's one of the ways that was built into environmental thinking from the beginning. And so making sure that there's an awareness of that, and that there's active work against that. Going back to Shane's point that we need, this is the movement, there needs to be active work against it. That was the root of the movement. I think is really important to what you were bringing up, Rob. So I'll pass it over to Michael, but I just wanted to bring that in.
What I wanted to say was about the presentation of the narrative. My wife's a media studies professor, so I think about this perspective a lot, but the capitalist state controls the presentation of information. There's, this extent to which we believe in freedom of the press, but we know very well now here in 2022 that the press needs money and wants money and is controlled by money, and money is controlled by the white supremacist puppeteers. So when Phoebe says the notion that climate change is due to overpopulation has been debunked, it absolutely has, but from whose perspective and to which audience has it been debunked? And I'm extremely cynical about that here in 2022. And I am in a red town in a purple state. And so the people I see around me in my local paper, for example, give me ample opportunity to witness that nobody is thinking about overpopulation not being the problem, because few people are thinking about climate change as a problem here. And this really skews my view. Here I am editing a journal about environmental justice from this spot. So I feel like everything I do is more radical because it has to burst through from this media context and my immediate surroundings. And so I come to discussions like this to try and right my perception. So please, you all, correct me if you think I'm wrong.
Thank you. I think Shane is next, but also I think you've been, in your book, it is How to Fight Fascism. So that's a good way to move in this direction.
Totally. I am a cautiously optimistic person about these things. I frame stuff as the end of the world, but like an optimistic, happy end of the world, and I think that there's a few reasons why. I think that we've seen over the last 15 years, a dramatic shift in young people, their sense of organizing, their sense of intersectional organizing, their sense of how things are tied together. And I think that the conversation we're having is not unfamiliar to folks under 35. I think they actually are pretty adept at it. What I think people are struggling with then is how to put teeth back into the environmental movement, since they are rebuilding it. And they are rebuilding it, right? The previous tools were foundationally not about the environment in the end. They're about maintaining white supremacy. So how do you build an environmental movement that didn't have the tools you needed? I think people are struggling with that. So they're trying to, for example, move past overpopulation narratives, but they haven't quite figured out how to talk about consumption narratives or about manufacturing narratives. It hasn't quite gotten there yet. And so I am optimistic in their ability to do it, because people are so rapidly rethinking how to organize, and they're doing it so effectively, that I have a lot of sort of trust in it, that if people can stay focused on that they will. And they're finding ways of doing this because of the facts of the matter is that things are getting pretty bad in a lot of places, and people sort of like being forced to organize. So we saw it around like the pandemic, creating mutual aid networks that were actually quite effective, that couldn't have been this effective 30 years ago, finding other ways of coordinating with labor movement, all kinds of different things. So I think like people actually have a lot of those tools. It's about how they're going to really funnel in on the environmental crisis. And the only way to do that is to talk about the conditions that are underneath it, which is the continuance of white settler colonialism, capitalism, and the state. So, I mean, we're going to have to talk about those foundational things if we want to get there, but I think that's the direction people are headed.
And I have two things to add to that. They're kind of like I think they're ish questions. But just for the people who are watching, I know that this is a fascism and eco-fascism and climate fiction, but I really feel like this nonfiction, this conversation needs to be had, particularly for writers and people who are involved, so that we can act and then write about the act of dealing with these things, because the pessimism is absolutely there. So this is for everybody, but also I'm going to kind of start with Shane. Is it that because of the increase in awareness and anxiety about climate change globally, does it seem like people are going towards fascism as a quick fix? Or is this kind of like, a process that communities kind of have to work through to get to the real solutions? Because obviously fascism and capitalism, as Michael has pointed out, they're very much interlinked. So I wonder if that is the thing, or can it be short-circuited?
I think it's a little bit of both. Fascism is a radical solution to a radical problem. It's a radically bad solution, right? It's radically destructive. It's actually reifying the system. It's going back to the core of the system that's already the problem and saying, hey, how can we blow this up and make it even bigger, more totalizing? So I think there's a culture of desperation, not unearned, in what we're living with. We're talking about global pandemics. We're talking about wars that really are resource wars, and the increase of things like water scarcity. Things are really frightening, right? That's really, really scary. And so I think it's actually sparking that move towards sort of, there's a fascism scholar that used to call this motivating passions. It's the kind of thing that can get people into a radical movement. But what they're encountering is not necessarily the movement that we want them to encounter, right? If we're not in their ear, somebody else will be, and they'll retell their story in a different kind of narrative. And so I think people, in a lot of ways, are unable to, they don't always have access to those things. Like Michael has suggested, the narratives that are around don't really feed that. So I think when people are seeing actual existing climate chaos, and then someone saying, hey, it's overpopulation, they're like, well, I guess it's overpopulation. That it's all panic inducing. It all feels like it might be an answer. You don't actually know the actual scientific reality of things. It's not like a well kind of shared bit of information. So I think people are grasping at those things. And also they have to deal with the fact that they are raised in a white supremacist culture. That means they're more tinted to those explanations than they are towards ones that we're offering here. So I think, but the optimism here is that these, in a lot of ways, these forces are the same things that drive people to get really involved in actual revolutionary organizing movements. And so I think we have to say, we are in those communities when we're actively engaged with them and trying to shift them into those spaces.
Yeah. Michael, anything that comes to mind from that conversation, and then the Phoebe after that?
Go, Phoebe, go first while I construct my line of thinking, please. Thank you.
Shane, I love so much of what you said. And I think just to kind of maybe put a slightly different spin on it, I think, people are hungry for community, and white people have a different, as a white person, have a different access to different types of community. And oftentimes a lot of that has been negative because tinted through white supremacy, right? And so I think people are hungry for community, and they're finding, negative communities and communities that are spurring them towards action that is harming other people. And so I think particularly as I'm also hopeful about sort of Gen Z and some of the younger generations and their desire for community and their ability to start building community quickly, I'm hoping that that's going to start deviating people away from that. And I think that's also a reason why popular fiction can be such an important tool, whether it's science fiction and fantasy or romance or whatever popular genre you engage in, or a visual genre, because that's a way to build community really quickly, is through a story that people connect to. And then after that, you can start, bringing in people into all right, so maybe you really enjoyed this book, but now we can connect you to more environmental justice movements through that topic. So I think community is such a way to draw people together, obviously, but to pull people away from eco-fascism, whereas eco-fascists are trying to pull people into their community. We see that through the different neo-woke communities that are actively recruiting people right now. So I think that's just a sort of different spin on what Shane was saying.
Yes, this does seem like a good time to bring fiction and the way fiction works into this. I started Reckoning in 2016 on one side of a coin, which I think I'm now looking at from the other side, and only just beginning to grasp what that all means. And perhaps the best way to encapsulate the previous side of the coin was Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Talents, and other books like that. I feel like there was a foresight that said, in the US specifically, and in the world to a different extent, the acknowledgement of people who weren't white, the critical mass of voters who weren't white or weren't straight white men or under their direct control was inevitable, and a sea change would occur. And the reaction from the right was ratchet up the insane tactics and keep ratcheting them up. And so now I look back at Parable of the Sower and was like, oh, to some extent, I think that was prescient, but also quaint. The dystopia we're presented in that narrative looks a lot like this one, but is so much more simplified and focused and directed. She did not anticipate Twitter. She did not anticipate the level of detail and complexity to things like QAnon and spiraling crazy. And then on the other side, we have the critical mass now. The mass of voters in this country clearly does not agree with the repressive, reactionary, fascist motivations, and yet here you have, Italy electing a fascist, Trump, having convinced all these people. Yes, all I have to do is say his name. So I have such high hopes for what fiction can tell us about what to do with all this now, but what I'm seeing fiction do is spread and not unify in the way that Octavia Butler offered us. I don't know who to point to as an Octavia Butler now. I can't point to Kim Stanley Robinson. So I think, as others are saying here, it's very promising. To read the Reckoning submissions is amazing. Everyone has these wonderful ideas. I sure hope that some of them catch fire, to go to a Hunger Games metaphor here.
Metaphorically speaking.
But I can't expect to know how that's going to happen or which of them to put my finger on. So it's a wait and see at this point, which is very nerve-wracking.
Well, that is a perfect segue, and I must say, as my moderating duties, I'm patting myself on the back. The timer just went off for us to go on to question number 2, which is, what role do you think climate fiction can play in the struggle against fascism? And I'm going to go to Shane, then Phoebe, then back to Michael.
I used to have a really functionalist idea of how social movements work. It's based on material conditions, real practical organizing. You pick a target, you pressure them, you win. Like the very kind of A, B, and C way of doing that. But I think what's happening now, what I think is a more useful frame, is to think about the future and what we're trying to build in a holistic way. It's not just about fighting X, Y, and Z. It's actually about building something that's capable of both fighting and sort of sustaining ourselves. It's sort of actually building a new future. And so I think with climate fiction, one, obviously it builds imagination. I think things like Solarpunk build an actual vision of a new future that we're actually sort of piecing together as we participate in it. So the diversity that was just kind of brought up, we're actually having a kind of flattening of the climate of the fiction world in a great way, because that's allowing not just one vision to pop up, but like kind of a multitude, and we exist in that all the time. So that imagination is really a great thing that's allowing us to envision how to do this better in a more totalizing way. And I think that that's going to give us real tools to win. But the other thing is, I think we have to start bringing this kind of joyous culture back into these spaces. Like, I engage with fiction not just as like a window to how I can win some material, change. I do it because that's an extension of like my own way of living a joyous life. And we have to, the only way to actually build a social movement that is capable of changing anything is to have people want to be there, that they actually can see themselves there, that they can build something there, that they can imagine a new future, that they can engage in art and lit and music and be a part of that. And so I think combining those things as much as possible, we don't just end up fighting back against the far right or fighting against corporations that are like, damaging the environment, pollution. We are building a total alternative to that, one that where the two worlds can't exist at the same time and one has to topple the other. So I think that that's actually part of that entire world building we should be engaging in.
Before Phoebe jumps in, just when you were speaking, Shane, it just brought me into mind just that the concept of state change. You're building something is boiling, water is boiling until suddenly something happens, and now it's a different thing. Now we're talking about steam. It's a state change. You don't know when that's going to happen, but you just know you're creating that environment. You're creating the bubbles. You're creating the heat until that thing does happen. And to Michael's point, you don't know when or exactly how, but you are creating that environment. To Phoebe.
Yeah, so I love what you said about joy, Shane. And I think this is one of the problems with environmental literature and CliFi and some of the subgenres as well, like so much of environmental literature being dystopian literature. Environmental literature in 20th century American in particular is built on fear. It's built on describing a situation that is scary enough that we will want, as the reader, to create change, whether that's voting or recycling, doing some sort of thing in our own lives. But so often that's even early environmental literature is based off that. My favorite example is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is nonfiction, but it opens up with a sort of dark fairy tale dystopia. Yeah, there you go, of what happens when a community experiences poison and what happens to that community. So the idea is fear-based, right? Is we have to make some change. And that has obviously created some change, as Silent Spring did from Rachel Carson, but it obviously hasn't been enough. So I think joy in environmental writing and in CliFi, and one reason why I'm so invested in solar punk is because there is that option for joy there, and coming into, we want to imagine these worlds that we want to live in, not just imagine worlds that we don't want to live in and try and enact change from that position. So I think that's like a really important aspect of it. And I think going back, Rob, to the original question too, as a white author, something that I am very conscious of in my writing, and I encourage other people to be as well when they're doing environmental literature, is to call out the white supremacist roots and make that part of the story you're telling. Talk about the fascists, the fascism and eco-fascism, and make sure that you're calling that out. But at the same time, I do think we want to have fiction that is joyful and engages in a future that we want to build. So yeah, that would be my response.
Yeah, that's great. If to think just about fiction and I'm going to call it a fringe movement because I think it still is that at this point, but solar punk being a place where people think in a small room with people who think maybe the same way about a few things and very, very differently about a lot of other things. All that is wonderful. It is inspiring. And each little instance of it strikes me as important work in the process of formulating something that can be much larger. I think the reason we've had so much dystopian writing, or a reason we've had so much dystopian writing, is because the dominant topia relies on fear. And I mean, this is a dystopia well established long before Rachel Carson. People have been attempting to scare us into changing our political organization. And I've spent hours trying to come up with real world examples of that working that are better than Rachel Carson, and I have none. But I have to acknowledge that there is work to get out of that mindset. Reckoning does not announce itself as a solar punk venue because I think that, for example, climate horror really has a place in all this. Many of us are horrified, and to process that and turn it into literally anything is valuable, to not just be paralyzed by it. So yes, this is why reckoning exists, just so that I can have this stuff poured into my head and be one tiny locus of this process.
Shane, anything to add before? Because as you guys, I'm not sure if you guys have the document posted as well. I've been adding questions and notes as you guys have been talking. But Shane, do you have anything else you want to say to that point? Because I think we started with Phoebe. My brain is working the wrong way.
I think actually just to second the inclusion of things like climate horror. I think having a full kind of 360 approach to this is really, really important. And I think that horror is an important way that people sort of manage the actual fears of their lives. So I think without that, we're really missing a strong piece. And it also is sort of what binds us to kind of like real kind of primal storytelling and things like that. And so I think bringing the climate collapse into our experience of folktales and mythology is really important. So I agree on climate horror. Also, I'm a horror stan, so any reason to get more horror.
Yeah. And also, it's kind of like the process of grief, right? You cannot just jump to the end, otherwise you need to get your money back from your therapist, because you miss some things and trying to deal with that. We have still a couple more minutes on this question, and I was wondering though, because we're talking about climate fiction in general, and we want to make that connection between climate fiction and fascism. What's the role of climate fiction can play in its struggle against fascism? And it's got me thinking, if conservatives, in whatever community we're talking about, embraced climate change as a problem that money needs to be spent on this now, then the question would be between a fascist, eco-fascist future versus a solar punk future, or something else in between.
Wait, say that last part again, please.
So if conservatives in any community, we'll talk about generally, were to embrace climate change as a problem that requires a solution, and the solution that we're putting billions of dollars into, trillions of dollars into fixing, then a question then is, now there's a left and a right. Now, what is the fight over? Is it going to be a kind of, now we're talking about an eco-fascist future versus something else? Because now we're talking about which solutions are we going to be walking towards?
Yeah, this is very hard. I mean, there's carbon capture, which the corporations are very much in favor of, because it is something that they can point at without changing the massive infrastructure that pours the money into their pockets. I don't want to say we should stop doing carbon capture. I feel like Twitter is full of that. It's full of people who feel it is their purview to come down on the hard ideas without necessarily going out, sorry, not the hard ideas, the eco-fascist ideas, without trying to incorporate them. I mean, the actual progress forward is going to come from neither the left nor the right, inevitably. I phrase that in the form of a question, and I look at you, Craig, because I don't know, but I have to hope that if there is to be progress made, that it will both involve carbon capture and hopefully not shooting little balls of metal into the atmosphere. There's all these really catastrophic solutions to a catastrophic problem. And I think they already do. I think the right already does absolutely recognize climate change as a problem, but they recognize it as a problem of people thinking climate change is a problem, not so much as wanting to actually address the facts of it. And then the extent to which they do actually want to address the facts of it, they want to use it to consolidate power like they've been doing.
Well, and Michael, do you mind if I jump in?
Yes, please.
Because what you got me thinking of is, I think then it starts to become something of a class issue, right? Is that we have, the right that's wealthy, and they're the ones who know climate change, like believe that climate change is happening and are adjusting for it, like ExxonMobil, that's been so well established, And I think that's when it starts to become a class issue, right? Is that it's these people who are positioning themselves as conservative Republican, fully capitalist, wealthy beyond what the average person can imagine. And and they're the ones who are promoting certain fixes that maintain their position of power. Whereas there are going to be other people who will be promoting fixes that are for, the masses, essentially. So is that you think part of this conversation as you were thinking about it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe just to keep talking about this, like I'm currently in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, is Northern Appalachia, and so I'm thinking a lot about how the propaganda has worked well with certain groups of people where they don't believe in climate change, but whereas it's not because they don't notice that the weather is changing or that the creeks are flooding. It's a much more complicated issue than that. So, and I'm sure you see that where you live in Michigan as well. And so I'm just thinking about how that's not like the conversation, if that makes sense. It's a class disparity that's part of this in terms of how people are affected.
I think there's like the sort of far right solution to climate change is to protect people. It's not really to confront the climate, right? It's to keep people out, it's to reify borders and things like that. I think if we actually want to think about what stabilizes the climate, we have to think about completely reorganizing society, and that involves all of us on a horizontal playing field. And you can't have this dramatic disparity in wealth because that's directly correlated to large kind of bumps in consumption where climate change actually exists. And so I think, what we can sort of offer is say something like carbon capture. I don't know, maybe that's a way station. Maybe that's like helps people get, not have it collapse in the next 6 months. All those technologies may be fine, but the problem is we will not find any perfect technology that will allow us to have a society like we have now for hundreds of more years. There's just simply no way to do it. And that's the same thing that's true in a lot of other kind of fulcrums of power. We can't continue to have a patriarchal society like this that victimizes most of the population. We can't have a lot of things. So I think if we think about those intertwined and think about how you reorganize those sorts of things, and then how you create kind of a large revolutionary movement that can actually win that, I think you're able to take it away from those things because there's just such partial solutions, if partial is even the right word. They're just kind of like these micro answers to a giant macro problem.
I mean, and bringing the question back to fiction, and when I say fiction, I don't mean, a short story or a novel, though certainly that's part of it. The size of the problem also needs to be equal to the size of the story that's being told about it. So people aren't reading as much as on TV. So it used to be pulp. Pulp used to be the thing many years ago, but now it's TV. Now it's the drama. So I wonder then if it's once you start seeing big solutions or less corporate solutions or anti-corporate solutions as a regular thing on, Fox, and because Fox TV is different from Fox News, that will be the thing that kind of makes the change, because we are trying to change people's imagination of what's possible.
Yeah, ideation is a big thing I think about a lot. I think about the people I meet on the street in the park, and how what is going on in my head and now my kid's head is completely divergent from theirs as to perceiving what the little creek is doing that runs through my park, what I want that creek to be doing. These people see me on a daily basis wading in that friggin' contaminated creek, pulling plastic bags and stuff out of it. And I know that feels futile to me, and I'm told that it is futile, and I keep doing it. And the way I rationalize it to myself is that I am giving someone else the idea that someone is doing this. The teenagers who throw their little vape pens into the bushes, and I get the vape pens out and walk past the teenagers and throw them in the trash. This is me indulging in my personal bitterness, but the way it applies to fiction is every time you write something creative that presents a different world, someone is going to have a sense, someone is going to normalize those ideas. And I know this works because it works on me. 10 years ago, I was afraid to do a bunch of things that I'm doing now because I thought, I don't know, suburban America would condemn me for it. And now I have this wonderful, supportive community of weirdos to give me reason to think that it's okay for me to do insane things like wander in the contaminated stream. So more of all that, please. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
On TV.
I mean, I don't need it to be mass media, but that's me. And that's another sort of bone I want to pick on this panel, I guess, and which has come up today already in other things I've listened to, that I look to the indie presses. AK Press is awesome. PM Press, which is also in Oregon, they're awesome. You know, Reckoning's trying, Stellaform, Android Press. This isn't TV. Nobody's Games of Thronesing the new Sim Kern collection. And yet, everyone who's reading that, those are the people I want to talk to. And I have to think that each one of them is doing the equivalent of wandering around in their local brook, influencing their fascist neighbor in some small way, even if it's to piss them off and make them buy more guns. I don't know. That part is my cynicism talking.
Well, yeah, and maybe, and Shane, I'm sure you'll have good thoughts on this as well, but maybe I'm a pessimist, but I really don't think we will see these in major popular forms of media, whether it's a like incredibly best-selling book or a Game of Thrones version of a show, because if it's going to inspire people to the degree that it has to be, then how is a traditional publisher, how is Hollywood, how are these people going to produce it? Like, how is this not going to challenge their mindset to such a degree that they're going to still be willing to produce it? And so that's why I looked to the indie presses too. I had a note to make sure and mention AK Press, PM Press, Haymarket, Stellaform, of course, Android, because there the constraints are different. And I think we can tell more radical stories because we don't have the capitalist hierarchical constraints that publishing and media tend to have. But that might just be me being a pessimist about this whole situation. But I think still having people that are influenced even by one book, but then going into their communities, Michael, like you said, like that doesn't mean that those books can't be radical sources of change. It's just making sure that the people who read them are willing to go out into their community and organize and make friends and make community. And so, yeah, that's kind of my interpretation of it.
I think this may be a question of where imagination comes in. I think maybe there may even be a worse thing that's happening, which is actually they are telling these stories. They actually do tell revolutionary anti-capitalist stories all the time and sell them back to you for high prices and make it part of the texture of your life and not a radical break with the existing world. And that's why you can have like the Hunger Games and have it be a massive franchise that does absolutely nothing to go after the system as opposed to the critiques. And I think that kind of cultural complacency, it's not people's fault. It's not, they aren't choosing to do that. It's actually a lot, and it's hard to kind of figure out how you make your way into being a challenge of existing structures. So I think if you're thinking about climate fiction, I think maybe it's also about rethinking the things that have not worked narratively, like what has not actually connected with people, rethinking what that fulcrum point is. What is it that what was actually a break for people, and how does fiction do that? And then how to mobilize those people when it does happen, because it's not going, we have to actually take people out of that space a little bit, have like a social work mentality of like, hey, we have to actually kind of unite with those ideas. If they're encountering these ideas in fiction, what do those ideas mean in the real world, and how can we be a part of that? And I think what's happening is that I think there's a lot of people primed for that. I think there's millions and millions of people that are primed for that. They actually do see some of these narratives, but they also live in the same world that we live in. But if we don't intervene in some way, if people don't intervene, then it will just become part of the wallpaper of their lives. These stories of like revolution, of new worlds, of climate collapse, they are around us all the time. And unless those are made real, unless someone has like bridged from those ideas to the real world, then they'll just kind of play on repeat, and they won't ever actually as a fracture for them.
When you say someone to make that change for them, are we talking politically, so a political leader, or are we talking religious leaders? Are we talking, well, I guess the word I'm looking for is influencer.
I don't even think necessarily in that hierarchical way where it's like an individual. I think just having folks in a community that are able to, hey, like help folks to realize what their ideas are and to realize how to put them into action. So I think just like communities that actually engage in real ways. When you're talking about political leaders and religious leaders, I mean, those communities have that dynamic, you know, like I'm sure there's a lot of folks on kind of left uncomfortable with churches and things like that. But the reality is that churches are one of the few non-commercial ways that people actually engage in real community with each other. So I think it's thinking about how do you kind of replicate that so that you get people out of the isolation of experiencing fiction as a story that they're able to put away, and to have it be integrated into like how they take action around it. Like, what do those ideas say to you, and what do you actually do with that? I think a lot of people are really unsure of what to do with their feelings about this sort of stuff. They are really, really unsure about what that means to put it into action. And again, this is coming back to like the original question of ecofascism. If you're not there talking to somebody, somebody else is. Like there are lots of people who would like to tell people that their discomfort with the current climate situation is actually about immigrants. There's a lot of people that want to tell them that, and they will tell them that. And so I think it's useful to start to like say, like, actually, your radical ideas about this, that can really happen. You know, you can actually be a part of that. There are people trying to do that, and you can join with them. And building that real kind of community where you're invested, where it's based on joy, that's what I think transfers people from just that isolation of experiencing a narrative to starting to make that narrative a part of their life.
So there are questions here. Oh, good. So Justine, you're handling them. I was trying to figure out how do I get to those questions. There was one more question which I think is connected before we get to the questions from the audience, which is: are there any works of climate fiction that you think are do a particularly good job of challenging fascist ideology, or is that something that you're currently engaged in writing on your own?
I had a hard time with this question.
Yeah, this seems to be part of the
my
problem.
answers are older. I mean, so I've been reading Laurie Marx's Elemental Logic series, which is from the 90s, or she only finished it recently, but it's an old series. And it is set in a fantasy world where there's a fascist culture and an anti-fascist culture, and the fascists are colonizers. And they show up and are utterly unable to conquer. So it's I don't know if it's a Vietnam analogy, but something like that. The indigenous peoples of this valley are too entrenched, and the climate is forbidding to the invaders. And so the indigenous people must absorb the colonizers through war and the breaking down of war. And it is wonderful. Like whenever I read a horrible, very worth reading piece of climate horror or dystopian fiction, then I go to the next one of these books and my faith in humanity is restored. It's like family level, granular community building. They're wonderful.
Michael, would you mind putting that into the document under question 3?
Yes, question 3.
Anybody else on that topic? And if not fiction, or nonfiction you can think of, people who are talking about this right now who are not in this panel. We talked about the idea of influencers, and yet we cannot get away from them. There are people who I think should be talking about this. Are there people talking about this on a regular basis in a way that we find not only good news for the soul, but also for elements of fiction that writers can then be using in their own work, if this is not fiction?
I mean, I think the solar punk world in general offers like a really kind of bright spot in that. I think there are like writers that bring in radical politics in a way that I find more sincere and artistically useful, like Margaret Killjoy. I think that is actually a bright spot. There was like this, Margaret talks about this a lot, there was a lot of really bad radical fiction for decades, and it's actually changed quite a bit. It's a lot different, So like I've been putting together a solar punk anthology, or will be working on it. And it's actually really great because I can find lots of kind of radical authors who are just well-traveled speculative fiction authors. And so I think that's useful. I think that there's, ironically, given its precedent, but I think there's like a trend of new Lovecraftian fiction built around the climate that I think does something really, at least connects with me a lot. I think it connects with a lot of people looking to put names on dread. Laura Morrow, there's a number of folks that I think do a really good job with that. And I think also folks that are working hard to actually make solar punk a thing that's identifiable, that can build a community. Becky Chambers, other authors that are like kind of standing out on that, I think are also a really great sign of that. It's also, I do lean more in the horror direction, but I also find something sort of optimistic about people who do want a positive, optimistic sci-fi world. And that's like uncommon, I think. It has been uncommon in the world dominated by dystopia, which is why solar punk is actual creative intervention that's based on that forward forward direction.
And Shane, like with Mike, would you mind putting the people that you talked about into the doc as well? Phoebe, I so you're nodding your head and also scratching your chins, like, who else can I talk about?
Oh, always. So Margaret Killjoy, I want to second her recommendation, or the recommendation of her. And also, I think N.K. Jemison's work isn't always, like, I don't think the Broken Earth trilogy is always read with this viewpoint. I think there's actually a lot to learn from how N.K. Jemison positions communities in the Broken Earth trilogy. And I would, from an environmental standpoint, from an imperialist standpoint, from, you know, pushing back against settler colonization. And I think it's really useful to go back and reread that trilogy with sort of thinking about these ideas in mind. And then also, and I have not read all of this because I have been just too busy, unfortunately, but Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White, which has a lot of horror aspects to it, but also is pushing back against Christian nationalism, which I think is, of course, leans into different fascist movements. And so, yeah, those would be my recommendations in terms of literature that might be useful.
Okay. Since we're almost out of time, I was gonna also say this is kind of like basic text that people are already having these conversations. Green Planets, Ecology, and Science Fiction, I think, has a lot of starting points. They do go in depth about the whole idea of deep ecology as well, and a lot of reference points in the bibliography. So now to questions. Justine, are you handling that? I don't know what to do on this side.
There's one in the chat which I could read out loud, or you could read it out loud.
I see it. This is from Rona Fernandez. I agree with Shane about the cultural complacency. Also, organizing needs to work in parallel with creative imagination work we are doing as writers, artists. Do any of you see indie publishers, authors, editors having an impact shifting mainstream publishers in any way on these issues? And I have a conversation. I can say something on that, but I'll go to the panel on that first.
Mainstream publishing is so white supremacist. No, but also yes. They are swayed by eyeballs and dollar signs, and you know. So Richard Power's Overstory got published by a major press, and Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass got published by a major press, if I remember correctly. So someone thinks
that's Milkweed.
Oh, okay.
Milkweed put it out originally.
That's right.
It might be not reprinted now, but
yeah. Lenora said, Lenora Hitchell asked to put it in the chat. The thing is with the chat, that's going to disappear. So that's why they're being. I'm asking them to put them into the document, which I linked. Justine, do I have it still copied and pasted? Do you mind posting that link again? Or no, hold on, I can do that very easily. I'm gonna do that right now.
Well, actually, jumping on this, I think I know nonfiction publishing a little bit better because I've had more experience with that. And I actually say that it actually has changed really dramatically in the last 10 years because radical folks are the ones to buy books. It's just that, and so that actually shifts the market. So, you know, I had a friend, an anarchist, write a book on organized labor, not usually the sexiest topic for people, but get a 6-figure advance and have it become a bestseller. You know, this is not something that would have happened 10 years ago. And there's like radical books, anti-fascist books, things like that. So like that, they're like on real, like really very serious lists. And then I think, you know, you see indie radical books hit bestseller lists and that pushes it as well. So like when Adrienne Marie Brown's book, when Pleasure Activism was on the bestseller list, you know, that's uncommon for AK Press, but then led like a number of books, you know, Robert Evans, other folks to be on, you know, kind of bestseller list too, which I think pushes mainstream publishing. Also, if they can see indie publishers actually competing with them in the same marketplace, it does actually affect it. And I think it's a testament to the fact that, like, frankly, more tepid works do not connect with people in any way. There's just, people don't really want boring, stilted, you know, liberal politics and stuff. It simply does not engage anyone under the age of 40. And so I think like that's being the message to them. Again, whether or not they reify that, whether or not that actually creates complacency, I think is up to us. But I do think it's changing for the better, not totally, but changing for the better.
Yeah. I mean, on the idea of complacency, I think one of the things that we particularly forget about or kind of take for granted in the West is the idea that democracy requires you to be engaged on a regular basis, and it's something that is hard to do if you're poor, but it's still it's there. And so, fascist or fascist-ish or something to the akin to it makes it easy for you to kind of shift the responsibility to those who are, these are the politicians. That's their job. It's their job to take what we want and kind of put it into policy, which can be a politically, geared fascist policy. But to this question about the influences, I would say that in some cases, you can have kind of like a tail wagging the dog when it comes to like research and academia. So you can have someone with a particular agenda, and then that becomes what they're paying people essentially to do research on, and the research then gets documented and used in, say, court cases. It works for the right. There's absolutely no reason it cannot work for the left. The idea that there is an agenda, essentially a philosophy underneath of all these things. It just takes time to make sure that that is the thing that we're having conversation about. I just don't think that the left is as weaponized, I guess, as the right is, need to take the idea that this is actually a fight. It's a philosophical fight, needs to be won. Were there any other questions? I don't see any more hands. Justine, do you notice anything? Because we're coming up on time. I want to leave some final thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's no more questions have come in, so it's perfect time to wrap it up.
Awesome. So we'll start with Phoebe, then Michael, then Shane for final thoughts, things that you want to throw out there, and it can be what you're working on now, along with like a big idea you want people to kind of take away from this conversation.
Yeah, I want to go back to, you mentioned, Rob, about people that we should be following. I think Adrienne Maree Brown is a great person to be reading, and Adrienne also writes fiction, so perfect for science fiction and fantasy folks as well. So that's definitely someone to follow. Right now I have a novella coming out from Android Press next year, where I did specifically think about fascism and eco-fascism in particular when I was thinking about the antagonists of the book. So that might be something people want to look at. It's going to be called When We Hold Each Other Up. And I think too, I just want to thank all of you all. This was a great panel. I so appreciate the conversation, and I hope folks enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. And Michael?
Well said, Phoebe. Everything Phoebe said. Also, Reckoning's got a special issue coming out in nearly 2 weeks. As soon as I get off this panel, I'm going to go back to going crazy about it, but it's a special issue about bodily autonomy. And as I was thinking about this panel topic, anti-fascist fiction, I kept thinking about a few of the stories that are coming out in that. There's some really sharp satire, which when I started reading it, I was like, oh my God, there's so much eco-fascism in here, I can't possibly bear it. And then I figured out what was going on. Really good. Rimi Chatterjee, the story is called A Question of Choice. It's set in India. It's phenomenal. I won't be able to come up with them all off the top of my head now, but I really encourage you all to look at those. They'll be appearing for free on the internet in the coming weeks.
Thank you. You reminded me of a question we didn't get to, which was how are these conversations being had in the non-Western press? But Sailor B, time. Shane.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me and allowing me to be a part of it. So I like I mentioned this in the beginning, I have a book coming out in just about 2 weeks. It's a nonfiction anthology, but it has a bunch of actually has a bunch of fiction authors in it. Margaret's in it, Margaret Killjoy's in it, and other folks. And it talks about like kind of the feature of anti-fascist activism. It's got a bunch of different stuff. I think one thing that I think to walk away with is that we also, I think, being in a fiction community also means that we can mind the fiction community and take responsibility for it in a weird way. And so I think about this in the same way of like that sad sick puppies thing a few years ago, where there are like people that don't want people like us to dominate fiction field. And I think that puts on us is to kick them out and to kind of clean house. And so I think that's one thing I want to walk around with this thing, like how do we take the space that we're in and make it our space, and specifically by making it not their space. And so I think that's actually a useful thing that folks in this space are doing and can do. And that's something I think about in the future.
Awesome. So two ideas for me to end on before I say thank you all to everybody. A book to look up is Institutions and Democracy in Africa. And this is a pretty thick book, but it goes through all the different permutations of democracy in Africa and in the last, I don't know, I want to say like 70 years. And all the experiments and democracy are happening right now there in real time. So I highly recommend becoming a bit more knowledgeable about that. And this is a good place to start because it's all about engagement. We really want to see that engagement in the fiction that we're telling as well. And as the idea of the ecology being a coming from a white supremacist place, United States, the white majority will no longer be the majority in say 10, 20 years. So then that question, that problem will eventually go away. The problem then is that fascism is an export, right? So making sure that what comes next, who comes next, don't just pick up that torch, and then burn everybody with it. So on that note, there's a lot of fiction out there. There's a lot of nonfiction that's in the document. The document's going to be up there forever. I'm going to put it somewhere it's easy to get to. Hopefully the panelists will add more as it comes to think of it in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. You have options. I'm going to leave it for you guys to be able to share anytime. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and for listening and for watching. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your first climate conference. Thank you very much. CliFi conference. Thank you very much, everyone. And recording is, do I press this button or is it Justin press this button? It says stop.